This section, Power, Politics, and Glory, is concentrating on art that is made to glorify political power, would be the best way to describe that. The Heiji Monogatari scroll, the first links that are on the syllabus, I'm not going to really spend any time on it. Just think that having that link to see the entire scroll is interesting. Uh, One thing to point out there is that that scroll, as you see it on that website, does not exist. That's a virtual version. That over time, pieces of the scroll have been cut up and are in different museums around the world. It's actually pretty typical. The identifying information in your textbook says where the object was made and then where it resides today. And very often, art moves around throughout its life. So the Monogatari scroll no longer exists as you see it there. The first one I am going to show you is Triumph of the Will. So this is a hour and 45-minute movie glorifying the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler when he came to power, full power in 1935 after assassinating several of his critics. And so this movie is really meant to stir up the emotions of the German people, getting them ready to go to war, basically. And Leni Riefenstahl, a female director, for her time was really innovative. The fact that a woman was being asked to be the director in 1935 was perhaps unusual. But she did a number of very experimental techniques for the time. You just saw an aerial shot, something that had not been done much in 1935. To us, that seems pretty basic, but so these were new techniques that she was trying out. She was really considered a brilliant filmmaker for her time, but because she had Adolf Hitler as a client and was sympathetic to his ideas, needless to say, she didn't do much work after World War II. Another thing to point out, going back to those elements and principles, those kind of building blocks of art, I think it's important to look at what Leni Riefenstahl is doing from that point of view. So she's doing a few things here with the way that she's composing the screen to get her message across. So right here you see a view from above looking down. You see in many of the shots you see in this film, there's a real emphasis on numbers, on repetition. So really showing that there's huge numbers involved, huge amounts of material involved in this production. The rally that you see later on in the film was the Nuremberg rally, and it was estimated that there were 100,000 people there. This was the camp that was set up outside of Nuremberg to house all the people who went to the rally. And you'll see their themes throughout it, a lot of collaboration, like cooperation, a spirit of community. They're well fed, they're clothed, which may not seem like a big deal, but this is in the heart of the worst economic depression that we've ever known. So having a good meal and some new clothes was a pretty nice thing at that point. Skipping ahead a little bit in Triumph of the Will, here's a scene when the rally is actually taking place. Again, you have a top-down picture to show the enormous numbers of people there. Another thing you'll see as you go through it is she's doing kind of the opposite. There are lots of shots of her with her camera from down below looking up. And that point of view very often is to make things look bigger than they really are. Think of a child looking up at a parent. So monumental sculpture, the Marcus Aurelius statue that's in the first chapter of your book is a good example. A monumental sculpture, when you stood at the base of that, it made Marcus Aurelius seem larger than life. So Leni Riefenstahl is using these elements and principles to really emphasize the idea that this is a mass movement. Krzysztof Wodiczko is an interesting artist because I like including him in this section because, of course, this work definitely could be considered a work of protest, the subject of the next section. But interestingly, he is using buildings, these sort of images of power, as the backdrop for the work that he's doing. So it's an interesting combination of him trying to give a voice to the powerless, but using images of power as a literal backdrop for these projections that he does. So the Washington Monument is a good example. The battleship Potemkin and this particular scene, which is called the Odessa Steps scene, it's by Sergei Eisenstein, filmed in 1925. But an important thing to point out here is that he is recreating an event that happened almost 10 years prior, at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, when people in the city of Odessa were waving to a ship that was arriving, some loved ones that had come back on a ship. And these soldiers that you see here are Cossacks. They're soldiers of the Tsar, the king of Russia, and they massacred these people who had gathered in a group but were peacefully awaiting the arrival of their loved ones. But the Tsar's soldiers took it to be a gathering that was meant to be violent. So Sergei Eisenstein is memorializing this event almost 10 years later with the battleship Potemkin. A couple things to point out, like Leni Riefenstahl, using elements and principles to kind of heighten the sense of violence and hysteria in this scene. So for one, something that was very unusual for the time is that this 7-minute scene has over 100 cuts in it. To us, that's actually pretty common. A 15-second TV commercial can have dozens of cuts in it. We're accustomed to watching film like this now. But back then, this was a really overwhelming visual technique that was meant to heighten the emotional aspect of this scene. Lots of close-ups like this. The intense kind of black and white quality of it is very stark. You can see it's sunny when it was shot. There's lots of harsh shadows. And of course, he is clever in using people in this film, the elderly, babies, people who are disabled. There's a man that appears a couple times that doesn't have any legs. So using people that are clearly meant to be vulnerable. And then the last thing to point out is that the victims, he's careful to show their faces. He wants you to see them as individual people. These are real individual people. But you'll notice that the soldiers, you don't see their faces. You never do. They're always from behind or in the shadow. So they're really meant to be kind of like faceless, soulless robots. And last here is Maya Lin's Vietnam War Memorial. Of course, this is not it that you're seeing right here. I wanted to start with this to give a sense of a more traditional memorial. Carving on Stone Mountain would be a good example. Again, the Marcus Aurelius statue that's in the first chapter of your book, similar to this. These are the kind of sculptures we often associate with memorials. Maya Lin, again, you see a theme developing here. I'm focusing on these elements and principles, but the Vietnam War Memorial really utilized this vocabulary because it's completely abstract. She's using shape, she's using color, or maybe the absence of color, black, granite. There's meaning in the material because granite is often associated with tombstones. She likes the reflective quality of black granite because it's like a gateway. You can see into the other side of it. So it's maybe a metaphor for the afterlife. And she's using repetition She's articulate about the fact that a picture is just of a person at a particular time in their life, but the name is something that was representative of them their entire lives. And the sheer volume of those names is overwhelming in a way that a traditional sculpture like this maybe can't get at. Interestingly, this sculpture was put up a few years after hers by people who objected to the nature of this memorial because it did not glorify battle. It's purposefully meant to be neutral and to mourn. It's like going down into the earth. It's a very powerful emotional experience if you've never been there. And as the video says, is one of the most visited memorials in the country. So there's a real testimony to the power of abstract design to evoke emotion in a way that a figurative sculpture could never do.